I made a video recently about the US sanctions on Afghanistan ever since the US pulled out and the Taliban took over the government there. The US immediately implemented sanctions onto the Taliban that have been causing massive abject misery there. And basically everyone, including like liberal NGOs and shit, are saying that this is going to result in starvation. Okay, I'll provide sources for that. Very easy. Don't worry. I actually source the things I talk about. Even when I'm streaming, a lot of people can't really seem to do that. But 1 million Afghan children could starve this winter. Are US sanctions to blame? Partly as a result of US policy, Afghanistan's economy is expected to contract by 30%. So I've been over this before. I don't want to go over it in too much depth, but the fact of the matter is that the US have sanctioned Afghanistan, isolated it from the world financial system. Afghanistan has enough food within it, but the damage to the Afghan economy has meant that most people can't afford it. Just like the way that this worked is essentially the US was propping up its puppet Afghan government, which had no legitimacy and was only there because it was propping it up. It invaded the country, it destroyed the country, and it propped up a government. It propped it up with tons of external funding in aid from the US, etc. When this government fell, the US seized the assets of said previous Afghan government. It also implemented sanctions on it. So obviously things are going to get fucked up very quickly. Now, of course, American imperialists will say to that, well, I don't care. The US shouldn't work with the Taliban or whatever. Well, we're not talking about the Taliban. We're talking about millions of Afghans. Whatever you think about a country's government, the welfare of that country's people depend on its government's ability to do shit, okay? Doesn't matter if you hate that government. So to be like, oh, tough shit, we don't like the Taliban. Yeah,
communism is based.
Just means that you don't actually care about the Afghan people and you're happy with them dying, as long as the government that rules over them isn't the one that you support. The reason why I'm talking about this again is because today Joe Biden announced a completely ridiculous thing. So yeah, just to reiterate my point that I was making there before I get into that, this article says the US-backed government was largely dependent on international donations to function, with over 70% of public spending and over 40% of GDP coming from aid. If you withdraw all of that, you know what's going to happen. You know what the consequences will be for normal people. Consequences that are far worse than anything that the Taliban is going to do to them in terms of human rights violations or whatever. Not even close. People literally starving and dying, suffering, their basic living standards going down is far worse than women not being able to go to school anymore, than girls not being able to go to school anymore, than oppression of women. I'm sorry, because women are going to die because of this. They're not going to be able to buy fucking bread. They're going to live in even more squalor because of this. Men too, boys too. It's worse. What they're doing here is worse. And that's not it. I was also talking about sanctions, but what Joe Biden did today is absolutely ludicrous. So there was about $7 billion of sovereign Afghan assets in the US, because as we know, as I've told you guys before, every country in the world has to bank within the US, the EU, the UK, etc. It's pretty much required to be able to access international financial markets and feed your people, to run a functioning economy. So Biden signs order to secure Afghan funds for aid 9/11 families. Now that aid part is misleading because these are $7 billion in Afghan government assets. They should logically, in any remotely sensible way, just go straight to the current Afghan government, okay? Regardless of how bad they are. Even if you think they're corrupt, well, the previous government was incredibly corrupt and that sure didn't stop you guys from giving them tons of money. Even if you think they're corrupt, a little bit of what they spend is always going to trickle down and alleviate at least a little bit of suffering. Doesn't matter how corrupt they are. That always happens. So just straight up depriving them of any sort of assets is essentially saying that you care more about like some sort of imagined ideal of preventing bad actors from getting their hands on cash than you do the fate of human beings who rely on their government to survive, who rely on their government at least functioning to survive. The $7 billion in frozen Afghan funds was held in the US, and he has allotted half of it for so-called humanitarian aid. Now, what that means is sovereign Afghan government assets, which the Afghan government needs to revitalize their economy in general, not just to buy so-called humanitarian aid, is going to be controlled by the USA, which will dictate how they can use it. The way that this works is essentially like the US government pays a bunch of money to NGOs and other such companies to like distribute this so-called humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, and the Afghan government has no choice in the matter. They take it or leave it. It's the USA spending their money how the USA wants. And that's obviously incredibly fucking fucked up. Because the problem with the Afghan economy right now isn't necessarily that there's not enough food. It's that The average person can't buy the food due to the massive economic depression caused by the US and its allies literally just completely stopping everything that they were doing to keep Afghanistan afloat, which itself is a crime, because the reason why Afghanistan is fucked up is because they fucked it up by invading it and starting a war and occupying it for 2 decades. It's not because of the Taliban, it's because of that. So there's that. And the most ridiculous thing about this is that 3.5 billion more of that sovereign Afghan state money has been frozen in case 9/11 victims sue the Afghan state and win a case against it so that it can be given to them as compensation. Holy shit. The Afghan state did not do 9/11. And even if they did, the funds for its people should not be fucking taken to give to 9/11 victims, okay? Fuck off. This is $3.5 billion that is needed desperately to help revitalize the destroyed Afghan economy, which was destroyed by the US and its allies. This is theft. The USA is stealing this money. Straight up stealing. Imagine if another country ruled that the US government owes compensation to victims of its wars or something, of its terrorist attacks, which it does constantly all around the world. The US, of course, would never pay up. It would never allow that country to seize its sovereign assets in that country, or whatever it had, in order to pay that. And we're talking things the US actually did. In this case, not only did the Taliban not do 9/11, but these are not the Taliban's assets. These are the Afghan state's assets. This is the property of the Afghan people. This is fucking ridiculous. Yeah, it's Germans suing Holocaust victims for Dresden reparations. That is how ludicrous this is. The situation in Afghanistan now is worse than it was before. Far worse than it was. Far worse than it was under the US occupation. And this is not because of the Taliban. The Taliban is shitty. They've made a bunch of awful policy choices. Or policy choices is a bad way to put it. I'm sorry. That makes it sound like a fucking neoliberal whitewashing shit. But, they have factually oppressed women and been killing political opponents and stuff. But that pales in comparison to what's being done to Afghanistan and the Afghan people right now through sanctions, through this freezing of assets, through this stealing of Afghan government assets, through this economic warfare being waged against the Afghan people in order to get back at their governments. Not even close. That article that I cited earlier said 2 million Afghans are at risk of dying, citing multiple credible sources like liberal NGOs, the UN food program, shit like that. So when these liberal institutions who are normally on the side of the US and so-called human rights are saying this shit about it, that things have gotten really bad. That things are really bad. But the people who try to frame the pullouts of Afghanistan as a massive disaster and an unprecedented, incredible disaster for human rights are silent now about this. Things are far worse now, and they're essentially just ignoring it. They might acknowledge it offhandedly once or twice, but they're not talking about it really at all. So we have the literal archetypical US imperialist guy, who we can use here as basically a stand-in for everyone else. Everyone who talked about the Afghanistan pullout, all of these liberal Twitch streamers who essentially support US imperialism whenever they see it as convenient. So the default position of these people, by the way, just to go over it, was essentially either one of two things. Either it's bad that the US is pulling out of Afghanistan because the Taliban is going to take over, which is obviously a pro-US imperialism position, and the more supposedly nuanced position where the US should pull out just because, it should. But still, this is terrible because the evil Taliban is going to take over and they're going to make things far, far worse. Now, what actually happened, as I just demonstrated, is the US pulled out, and then the US and its allies caused immense suffering in Afghanistan. They are the causes of this suffering. Not the Taliban, the US and its allies. Far worse than anything the Taliban could do, even if they wanted to kill fucking everyone. They couldn't kill them fast enough. They couldn't kill them as fast as 2 million of them are going to die to hunger. Okay? Even the worst case scenario these people could imagine is not as bad as what the US and the EU and shit are doing here. They went crazy over it. We had people like Dylan Burns tweeting about it 5 times a day. Please do not let your war weariness turn into disdain for those who are suffering right now in Afghanistan. Don't shout down those who exclaim their pain as they see the cities of their nation crumble under the force of far-right theocratic terror. Now, theocratic fascist terror. Now, the cities of Afghanistan do not crumble under the far-right theocratic fascist terror. The people of Afghanistan are currently crumbling under US sanctions, under the US freezing Afghan sovereign assets, under the US engaging in economic warfare to murder the Afghan people. Just to address this, because he's probably going to reply to this and make this point, because no, there's no such thing as humanitarian exemptions to sanctions, there's no such thing as medicine exemptions to sanctions, no such thing as food exemptions to sanctions. I've gone over this before. There's an entire academic literature analyzing this that very conclusively has shown that things like food and medical exemptions are simply on paper. They're there to make the sanctioner, in this case the US, the EU, etc., look good, and they don't actually work in practice. In practice, you still cannot import medicine, food, etc., at least not in any sort of realistic respect, because the laws on this are so unclear and companies are deathly afraid to go through with it. The fact that there are laws regulating this in the first place, that you have to register to do it itself stifles normal trade. And there's also the fact that general economic sanctions and stuff like that obviously impact a country's ability to even pay to buy food and medicine and stuff. Like the general inability to trade other sorts of economic stuff impacts its ability to pay for that stuff. So that argument doesn't work. Okay, it's a bullshit obfuscation of how sanctions work. It's only made by liberals who do not understand anything about this, who do not understand that's nothing but a PR exercise by the US government, or who, believe in what the US government is doing and want to whitewash it. So Dylan Burns was making shit like this all the time. We can breathe a sigh of relief for our young men and women who will no longer face danger in Afghanistan, while understanding the horror that civilians face in Afghanistan. The horror that civilians face at the hands of the USA's campaign of intentional starvation of Afghan civilians, man. He tweeted about this so much. Every single fucking day, like 3 or 4 tweets at least about Afghanistan, about how horrible it is. And then it all dries up. From like September onwards, there was basically nothing. Like hosting a debate on the war in Afghanistan, random jokes about Afghanistan, talking about like all stuff regarding the pullout. Nothing about the development since then. Now, he did try to form a rebuttal to me here, but before I go over it, I want to look at his YouTube channel so we can just see if he's made a video on this. Maybe he has. Who knows? He has fucking UN troops in his banner. Jesus Christ, dude. Oh, here we go. Afghanistan. Discussing our Afghanistan withdrawal with Xander Hall. So I just want to make it clear here. Dylan Burns was, at least he said that he was pro-pullout, though he thought that it would result in like a human rights disaster. He was just like, we need to get out anyway, So there is that. But he was trying to frame it in like, obviously a very imperialist way, where the US occupation was like there to defend human rights. Ergo, US stops occupying a country that it invaded and caused this problem in the first place is a disaster for human rights. The obvious imperialist implications of that are obvious. It's trying to frame the US as sort of a guarantor of human rights. Simple. Afghanistan from 5 months ago. 5 months ago, Hassan is bad. Afghanistan. Yeah, the last time he talked about Afghanistan on his channel was 5 months ago. He made tons of stuff about how, women's rights were in danger in Afghanistan, about how the pullout was necessary just because the US was there for far too long. Nothing about the actual US literally starving Afghanistan. Nothing about the US stealing Afghan assets. Nothing about the US withdrawing all of its aid to Afghanistan. Literally nothing. Nothing about the US causing immeasurably more suffering in Afghanistan intentionally than what this guy could ever imagine that the Taliban could do. Now, the reason for this is clear. This is an excellent example of sort of imperialist lying by omission. The US always plays the game of caring about human rights, right? Like it's a big part of their rhetoric. They claim to, be concerned about human rights in a country that is inconvenient for them geopolitically, that they don't like or whatever, that isn't aligning with them economically or whatever, right? And this concern for human rights then evaporates either in far worse situations when geopolitically it's more convenient for them not to talk about it, or when they're the ones who are causing awful human rights violations that are far worse than anything you could have imagined the people who they were claiming were going to violate human rights were doing. And that's this situation here. People who were concerned about women's rights in Afghanistan, people who were concerned about the violations of human rights in Afghanistan, about essentially the welfare of the Afghan people, at least according to them, suddenly don't care about the welfare of the Afghan people once it's not convenient for them. Once they can't use that talking point as a bludgeon to try and paint US imperialism as a positive force, as a force for good, as something that guarantees human rights. Once it turns out that the US actually didn't care about human rights, the US just was always playing a cynical geopolitical game where it invaded Afghanistan for its own geopolitical power reasons. It withdrew from Afghanistan for its own geopolitical power reasons because there's just no reason for it to really be there anymore. And now it's like, oh, we needed to worry because there was going to be a human rights disaster under the Taliban. The reason why there's been a human rights disaster under the Taliban has not been because of the things that they have done, and they have done many bad things. It's far and away been because of what the US, the EU, and other international actors have done since then to Afghanistan. What the Taliban has done is not even comparable to that. What about women's rights to food? What about women's rights to not live in squalor? What about women's rights to live in a functioning economy? What about the human right to not die of starvation? 2 million Afghan citizens, people who live in Afghanistan, are going to die of starvation according to multiple credible sources. The Taliban couldn't kill that many people if they tried to kill them, and that was their sole goal, was to just mass kill people. They couldn't do that. They would not manage that. You know who is managing that? The USA, the EU, the UK, all of these actors who never gave a single shit about the Afghan people, who have proven that beyond any reasonable doubt. And their propagandists like Dylan Burns, I'm not implying he's paid by them. He does it for free. He truly believes in what he says, and that just makes it worse. So, people like him, Vorsh, Xander Hall, all of these people who may have differed in their opinions on whether the pullout was good or not, but who were all in agreement on this idea that US imperialism is some sort of lesser evil that needs to be supported, or in the case of Dylan Burns, is something that literally guarantees human rights. Jesus Christ, man. Make no mistake here. Everything that's happening here is a cynical, geopolitical, global economic, etc. power play designed to cause mass suffering, starvation, the destruction of the living standards of the Afghan people, all intentionally done in order to weaponize the welfare of their population against their government. This is what sanctions are. This is what things like freezing the sovereign assets of other countries are. This is what they're for. To cause suffering in order to essentially force people to rise up against their government and overthrow it, so that the US can sort of swoop in and install a more favorable puppet government, which they will then magically start caring about people's welfare under, and start giving them aid again, remove the sanctions, give them their sovereign assets back and stuff like that. That's how it works. I've gone over how sanctions work so many times on my channel. I'm kind of tired of repeating myself on the channel. I go over it a lot. I repeat myself so fucking much because these people just have the same talking points all the time that are all very easily dealt with. When these US imperialist, so-called foreign policy analysts, people like Dylan Burns, tell you that they're worried about human rights somewhere, that if the US withdraws, human rights are going to go down the toilet. Everything's going to be fucked. They don't really care about that. What they care about is in a broader sense, framing the US as sort of a guarantor of human rights, and therefore legitimizing its sort of interventions as at least possibly righteous. When the US does bad things, it's not taken as part of that's essentially by design. They do bad things because their overall goal is bad, and that results in bad things. Their overall goal is to secure capitalist economic power and global capitalist hegemony for the US state, for its bourgeoisie. The most basic leftist analysis that anyone who calls himself a leftist should agree with. But they see things as something you can take on a case-by-case basis, rather than as part of a more systemic imperialism that has bad goals. So people like Dylan Burns have this view, and others like him have this view where, sure, the US does bad things, but those bad things were oopsies, and they're not part of a sort of broader imperialist system. It's possible for the US to be a guarantor of human rights. It's possible for the US to have good and pure motivations in what it does. Its claims to care about human rights are not just a cynical game. It actually does care about human rights. It just sometimes gets it wrong. All of that is bullshit. And this Afghanistan situation proves that beyond any reasonable doubt, because when they said they cared about human rights, they didn't. The human right to essentially live a functioning life with your basic needs being fulfilled are being denied to millions of Afghans by the US, by the EU, by everyone who claims to care about human rights. And I'm sure Dylan's response to this, if he responds, is going to be this. Hey man, I agree with you. The US shouldn't sanction Afghanistan. The US needs to give Afghanistan its sovereign assets. The USA needs to give the Taliban back the aid that it was giving Afghanistan before. I agree with you on that. You're being very uncharitable. You're being very bad faith here by assuming that I don't. The thing is here, Dylan, we're not saying that you don't agree with that, or at least you wouldn't have pressed on that. The thing is that you don't talk about it because it's inconvenient for your overall narrative, which I just went over. Yes, when pressed on it, you will certainly talk about it. Yes, you might mention something vaguely related to that, in a 20-second clip a single time on your Twitch channel.
Ro Khanna is challenging that standard. But Ro Khanna and Rand Paul has actually worked together on a lot of things when it comes to Yemen, for example. Even though I'm also going to call out Rand Paul recently for him continuing to support our holding of assets for Afghanistan. The libertarian one hand until it comes to Afghanistan.
So, yeah, man, you said that once in a 20-second clip. Great work. You also haven't made a video on Afghanistan in 5 months. This thing about the starvation and shit has been going on for 4 or so months now. Like, once it became inconvenient, you stopped drawing attention to it. Once it became clear that the US was still doing far more damage to Afghanistan than the Taliban could ever hope to do, as evil as they are, you stopped talking about it. You stopped tweeting about it. You bring it up in a 20-second clip. That's your rebuttal? That's the best you got? You must be fucking with me, man. And it's because of the reason that I just said. Only when called out on it will he mention it. Other than that, it's convenient for him to ignore it all. Like, imagine if Russia invaded Ukraine and I didn't announce that. That would be a pretty fucking shitty thing, right? If I just pretended it didn't happen, if I just, like, basically, like, never talked about it except, like, in a 20-second clip in passing once or twice. That would be really fucked up, right? Because I've denounced Russian imperialism before. That would make it seem like I was kind of just not really denouncing it honestly. That's what this is. It's the exact same sort of situation. So look, this proves that these people are just cynical campists for the US empire. That's what this is. Not just Dylan. Now, I singled out Dylan here, but this is not just about him. I'm just using him as sort of the quintessential example. Basically, this is also goes for the US government, for the EU and its governments, the UK, basically every single white American streamer in the Twitch politics sphere, aside from maybe Hassan. But he's not white, he's Turkish. I love my Turkish Hassan. So don't take this as like just a call down of Dylan personally. He's just a very useful example because he tends to be an exemplar of this sort of very dishonest human rights justification for US imperialism, or at least in order to frame US imperialism as a good thing sometimes, like something that it's bad to stop doing. But yeah, I think I've said all that I can say there, and I've pretty much perfectly called him out on how he's going to react to this. You know, he's going to claim bad faith or whatever. Buddy, I fucking pegged you here. You haven't talked about this shit at all. I gotcha. There's no response to this other than, yeah, man, you're kind of right. Maybe I should examine my biases here and think about why I haven't wanted to talk about this, even though I clearly know about it, why I haven't given it anywhere near the amount of attention that I gave the pullout. I made 15 videos on it. I tweeted about it like 200 times. Maybe the reason that I didn't do that is because I'm biased. Maybe the reason why I'm not talking about things being far worse now because of the US, EU, UK, etc. is because at the end of the day, I'm just very biased and partisan towards framing the US and the West as a force for good. That's what you should do if you're a good faith here. There's no other appropriate response. It's that simple. But you're not good faith. You weaponize the claim of good faith. Apparently, good faith is essentially just selectively applying your supposed principles and ignoring things that are incredibly inconvenient to you and directly relevant to things that you have talked about kind of obsessively, honestly, in the past, and talking with you obsessively in the past. Yeah, videos with titles drawing attention to Afghanistan, like 15 of them, is not the same thing as mentioning Afghanistan once or twice in a video about Jordan Peterson or in a clip about Jordan Peterson. Give me a fucking break. You know, I made videos on the Afghanistan pullout, and I've made videos in the sanction. For people like Dylan Burns, though, it's inconvenient. It's convenient to make the ones in the first one, because it fits in well with his overall narrative of the US being a guarantor of human rights. It's very inconvenient for the second one. So that's why he's sort of gone quiet, even though things are worse now. The US, like what the US is doing now, pales in comparison to what he was claiming is going to happen in the Taliban. Afghanistan is fucked. Like, what can we do here? I don't know. I'm a random guy on YouTube. I can't do shit. You can't do shit. The US is going to keep sanctioning and murdering Afghans. They're going to claim that it's not their fault because they have humanitarian exemptions or whatever, but we all know that's bullshit, as I explained earlier. And this is going to be ignored. This is going to be ignored by people who are pretending to care about like this hypothetical Russian invasion of Ukraine, as the geopolitical bloc that they support is actively murdering millions of people. They're not going to talk about it. That's how this shit works. This is lying by omission to support imperialism. Make no mistake, these people are not a part of the same political tendency as I am. I am on the left. They are not. And this sort of thing really proves that they are just liberal geopolitical campists, partisans for US empire. There's my Afghanistan clip. I'm very sorry that I can't do anything about it. I sure wish I could. I am a small streamer and some guy who makes video essays occasionally. What can I do? I can make videos about it, make you angry, call out other streamers, call out the US government. What's that going to do? I can't do shit. You can't do shit. None of us have any effect on anything, though Dylan Burns may one day, because he seems to be wanting to be a member of the State Department. Good luck with that, man. I really hope it goes well for you. But we can't do shit. We can draw attention to it, but what can we do, man? It's sad this is how imperialism is now. And the only way that we're ever going to fight imperialism is with united front against it, against US imperialism principally. Calling out this shit incessantly, especially Americans need to be doing it more than anyone else. They can't just be ignoring it when convenient for them. If you want to support leftism worldwide, you want to alleviate the suffering of human beings worldwide, the number one thing that you need to do is just oppose US imperialism, oppose everything the US does geopolitically. Talk about things like Afghanistan incessantly. That's your number one goal as an American, or at least, I don't want to say that you need to talk about this all the time, right? Like, if you make videos about shit that has nothing to do with this, but you're a leftist, fine, whatever. But when you make videos about shit like Russia's potential invasion of Ukraine, about shit like how the Afghanistan pullout is a human rights disaster, but you don't talk about, like, stuff like this, and you don't denounce the US empire for it, it's clear where your loyalties really lie. It's clear what your politics really are, and it's that simple. You're an imperialist, you're a US imperialist specifically, and that's the worst kind of imperialism for the world right now. I think the global left, at least the first world left, is in the worst state it's ever been. But the third world left is still going strong as always, but that doesn't really count for much when we are at the mercy of the US.